Well, on the eve of the United States tariff deadline, communities in countries affected by measures have voiced their displeasure. Protesters in South Korea, which signaled an 11th-hour deal for higher tariffs to begin, were unsatisfied with the negotiations. Farmers were among those rallying outside the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, wary American agricultural products may undercut their livelihoods. While the deal means U.S. importers of Korean goods will pay 15% tariff instead of a threatened 25% one, some say that's not a successful outcome.
I don't think the tariff was lowered from 25% to 15%. I think it's increased from 0 to 15%. That's why I'm very worried about this negotiation. In particular, the South Korea-US summit might include agendas such as defense costs and the import of US weapons, and that's also concerning.
In India, headlines have been dominated by Donald Trump's threat to force importers of Indian goods to pay a 25% tariff. The hike comes in response to India buying Russian arms and oil. India exported more than $100 billion in goods to the US in 2024. In the financial center of Mumbai, some have threatened to protest in response.
If tariffs are imposed, business will be impacted and we won't be able to sell our goods in America. Because of this, we should protest. But our government is already negotiating with the Americans. If they lower the tariffs, it will be better.
So let's get more on the impending tariffs with Professor Peter Draper, Executive Director of the Institute for International Trade at the University of Adelaide. Professor Draper, good to have you with us again today. Now, so the deadline for these U.S. tariffs is tomorrow U.S. time. Are we expecting, a flurry of last-minute deals to come through?
Good evening, Girish. I think with the Trump administration, anything is possible. We've already seen just in the last few hours, Pakistan announced that it's concluded a deal. Thailand as well. I'm sure there'll be a few others. But what we should recall is that the US targeted what it called the dirty 15. And so far we've got, by my reckoning, 10, maybe 11 deals done. So that leaves maybe 4 to be announced overnight. And we know India is not concluded yet, hence the US has imposed this 25% tariff on India.
Yes, we'll go to India in a bit, but we've seen the likes of Vietnam, South Korea strike these deals, even the Philippines, although it's just down by 1%. Tell us, who are the winners and losers here?
I think that depends on how you categorize winners and losers. So from a narrow deal negotiations perspective, any country that's concluded a deal with the US on a tariffs basis is the loser, because that country gives everything, the US gives nothing, except it raises its tariffs. So on those narrow grounds, they're losers. If you take the view that reducing their tariffs will benefit their consumers through importation of US products, then you could see there could be some winners in those countries. But obviously, as you were saying in your earlier segment, or as the reporter was saying, farmers, for instance, in South Korea don't feel the same way. They clearly feel they're losers. So every trade agreement generates winners and losers. These are particularly one-sided trade agreements. In fact, they're not even really trade agreements, frankly.
Yeah, so for India, it's perhaps facing the 25% tariff, as you spoke about. But, it's not a huge exporter of goods to the US. I think about a fifth of what China does. So might any possible slowdown in exports from India to the US be any blow to India's economy in the first place?
It could be a substantial blow. India exports about $60 to $70 billion worth of goods to the US, and it's a substantially smaller economy than China's. So exports to GDP, that ratio would be smaller, but you're still talking about pretty big export potentials. And the most affected sector would be pharmaceuticals. And President Trump has been talking about 200% tariffs for pharmaceuticals. So the US could cause a lot of pain for India if it wants to.
Yes, and India's fellow BRICS nation, Brazil, it's copying 50% if things do go through that way. More political in this case because of the trial involving the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, over that coup plot. So what are your thoughts on what's been regarded as a revenge tariff?
It's entirely a revenge tariff. So Brazil, like Australia, has a trade deficit with the United States. And this is all about the trial of Jair Bolsonaro, who is a political bedfellow with President Trump. And like President Trump, led, it would seem, of course, the jury still has to decide, or the Supreme Court still has to decide, a coup against the newly elected President Lula. So for President Lula to interfere on the basis that he's being threatened with US tariffs and effectively overrule the Supreme Court would be a major political and institutional crisis in Brazil. And there's just no way he can agree to that. In fact, what this is doing is it's galvanizing support for President Lula in the context of a forthcoming election in which prior to these tariffs, he was substantially down in the polls. So it's really mobilized his political base for him.
So, Peter, what do you make of the EU's deal with the US for a 15% tariff? Because, the European Union was talking quite tough over the past couple of months with the likes of Ursula von der Leyen. But do you see the EU capitulating to Trump?
I think capitulation is a fair description. Effectively, they were very worried about President Trump's Russia-Ukraine policy, and they really didn't want to push too hard. Plus, the member states themselves were divided in how to respond to the Americans, but also within that, whether to retaliate, and if so, how severely. But in the end, what they've done is to capitulate. So the Americans have got an unprecedented deal, I would say again, with the United States, and that's going to cause major political ructions in Europe over the next few months, I think.
So let's bring it back home, Peter. How has Australia been faring in all of this? Pretty quiet, but in the midst of these Trump-induced trade chaos.
Well, I think the lack of a meeting between Prime Minister Albanese and President Trump is probably a blessing in disguise. But if you'll excuse the phrase, in a sense, we haven't been subjected to Sauron's eye, so to speak, to adopt a Lord of the Rings metaphor. But it's just a matter of time before it swings back to us. I think what we're likely to face in the first instance is that all countries that don't have deals, their reciprocal tariffs are likely to be raised anyway, and Australia will be caught up in that mix. But the US is very unhappy with things like our social media policies, our pharmaceutical benefits scheme. I think we've already addressed the beef market access issue in recent days. So they're probably going to come for us and leverage things like AUKUS, for instance, if they feel like it.
Okay, sounds like we are the Frodo in this whole story, Peter. But just finally, now that all these goods that are coming from all the countries that have these extra tariffs, the American consumer will have to pay for them. So what have you been observing in terms of the impacts that these tariffs have had already in the US?
Well, I think we saw the best possible signal for that in the US Federal Reserve's decision last night not to lower rates, in spite of all the pressure that President Trump has put on Jerome Powell. And the reason they're not doing that primarily is because they are worried that huge inflationary pressures are building up in the United States. But so far, it's too soon to tell because there's so much uncertainty with these tariffs and their economic impacts, and they're affecting everything, and particularly investment decisions, but also imports into the United States decisions. One other metric worth looking at is that the US GDP, the announced increase was 3% in the last quarter. But that's on the back of a 35% drop in imports into the United States just in the last quarter. So if you think that's a success story, then maybe the US is doing okay, 3% growth, but imports are not collapsing, but they're seriously restricted.
Okay, we've covered lots of ground there. Professor Peter Draper, thank you so much for your time.